"They're beating my mama," the tiny mud-streaked girl sobbed, her small hands frantically clutching the heavy velvet cloak of the most feared underworld boss in Oakhaven. Dominic, the ruthless alpha, who ran the city's criminal empire with an iron claw, wasn't known for his mercy. To him, the slums were just another source of coin and blood. But as he looked down, the scent of this child hit him. It carried the distinct, impossible trace of winter pine and silver moon. A scent he hadn't breathed in 5 long years. What the notorious Wolf Lord did next didn't just shock the corrupt royal guards, it ignited a violent war that would fracture the kingdom. Listen closely, because this isn't just a fairy tale. It's a dark testament to betrayal, survival, and the terrifying lengths a monster will go to protect his own. The cobblestone streets of the lower ward stank of stale ale, wet dog, and rotting cabbage. It was the kind of rain that didn't just fall. It felt like it was trying to wash the city of Oakhaven off the map entirely. Dominic stood beneath the awning of the Rusty Boar Tavern, the shadows clinging to him like a second skin. At 6'4", with shoulders broad enough to block an alleyway and eyes the color of a bruised twilight sky, he was a man who commanded the dark. He wasn't a lord or a king, but in the subterranean hierarchy of Oakhaven, he was God. Dominic was the alpha of the Iron Syndicate, a ruthless conglomerate of werewolves, rogue magic users, and thieves that controlled the city's underground. They ran the smuggling routes, the underground fighting rings, and the protection rackets. Tonight was collection night, a tedious but necessary task to remind the lesser gangs who held their leashes. Flanking him were his 2 most trusted enforcers, Morgan and Finn. Both were massive brutes, scarred from countless territorial skirmishes, their predatory instincts barely contained beneath their heavy leather coats. "The Copper Coins gang is light this month, boss," Morgan grunted, his voice a low rumble over the torrential rain. "They claim the King's Guard squeezed them first." Dominic took a slow drag from his cigar, the ember glowing an angry red in the gloom. "The King's Guard answers to the king. The lower ward answers to me. If they can't find the coin, take a finger for every silver piece they're short. Let them learn the cost of poor accounting." Before Morgan could nod, a sudden commotion broke through the rhythmic drumming of the rain. It wasn't the usual drunken brawl or the shriek of a pickpocket getting caught. It was a high, frantic wail. A child. Dominic ignored it. In the lower ward, a crying child was as common as a rat in a cellar, but the sound grew closer, slapping bare feet against the flooded cobblestones. Suddenly, a small body collided with Dominic's thigh. Finn snarled, his hand instantly dropping to the hilt of his short sword, his eyes flashing a momentary amber. "Get off him, you little street rat," he barked, reaching down to grab the child by the scruff of her thin tunic. "Leave her," Dominic ordered, his voice dangerously quiet. He looked down. She was tiny, perhaps 4 or 5 years old, shivering violently. Her dark hair was plastered to her skull, her face a canvas of mud and tears. But it was her hands that gave Dominic pause. She was clutching the hem of his expensive velvet cloak with a grip so tight her knuckles were white. "They're beating my mama," the little girl cried, gasping for air, her wide, terrified eyes staring up into Dominic's cold face. "Please, you're big. You have to stop them. They're hurting her." "Get lost, kid," Morgan muttered, stepping forward to peel her away. "We aren't the town watch." But Dominic didn't move. His muscles had gone completely rigid. He wasn't looking at the girl's tears or her ragged clothes. He was breathing. Beneath the overwhelming stench of the city's filth, beneath the sharp metallic smell of the rain, he caught it. Winter pine and silver moon. It was a scent that didn't belong in the slums. It was a scent that didn't belong in the world of the living. It was the scent of his mate, a woman who had burned to ash 5 years ago in a fire orchestrated by a rival pack. A woman whose death had turned Dominic from a stern leader into the ruthless, unfeeling monster the city feared today. Dominic dropped his cigar, the puddle hissing as it extinguished the cherry. He crouched down, ignoring the mud soaking into his tailored trousers, bringing himself eye level with the girl. Up close, her eyes were a piercing, familiar shade of hazel. "Who is beating your mother?" Dominic asked, his voice entirely devoid of its usual lethal edge. "Bad men in shiny shirts," she hiccuped, pointing a trembling finger down the winding pitch-black alleyway to their left. "They wanted money. Mama said she didn't have it. Shiny shirts, the city watch. Corrupt guards moonlighting as thugs." "Show me," Dominic said, standing up. "Boss?" Finn questioned, bewildered. The Alpha of the Iron Syndicate did not run errands for beggar children. I said, Dominic growled, a deep primal vibration rattling his chest, his eyes flashing a terrifying luminescent gold. We are going for a walk. The little girl, who whispered that her name was Lily, ran ahead, her bare feet splashing through the murky puddles. Dominic followed, his strides long and predatory, the damp air parting around him. Morgan and Finn flanked him, their hands on their weapons, sensing the sudden dangerous shift in their Alpha's demeanor. The air around Dominic felt heavy, charged with a lethal static. They rounded a corner into a blind alley behind a butcher's shop. The stench of rotting meat masked the scent, but the sounds of a struggle were unmistakable. I told you, I need until Sunday, a woman's voice cried out, followed by the sickening thud of a heavy boot striking flesh. Sunday was 3 days ago. Whore, a male voice sneered. Captain Gideon wants his cut of your tailoring wages. You think you can live in his district without paying the toll? Dominic stepped into the mouth of the alley. 3 men wearing the chainmail and tabards of the Royal City Watch stood in the dead end. 2 were pinning a woman to the muddy ground, while the third, a bulky lieutenant, stood over her, drawing back his foot for another kick. The woman was curled into a ball, protecting her stomach and face. Her clothes were rags, her long dark hair matted with blood and mud. "Mama!" Lily screamed, trying to run past Dominic, but Morgan caught the child by the waist, holding her back. The guards spun around, drawing their broadswords. "Who the hell are you?" the lieutenant spat, peering through the rain. "This is watch business. Shove off before we arrest you for interfering with royal justice." Dominic didn't speak. He stepped into the dim light of a nearby lantern, letting the hood of his cloak fall back. The lieutenant's face went completely slack. The color drained from his cheeks so fast he looked like a corpse. Dominic," he stuttered, taking a panicked step backward. "Lord Dominic, we didn't know you were in the district." "You are collecting a toll in my territory," Dominic said, his voice a deadly velvet whisper, "without my permission." "We're operating under Captain Gideon's orders," one of the guards chimed in, though his sword was shaking. "The King's law." "The King's law stops at the main thoroughfare," Dominic replied, unbuttoning his cloak and letting it drop to the wet ground. "Down here, I am the law." Dominic moved faster than a human eye could track. It wasn't a spell, it was the raw, explosive power of an alpha werewolf. He crossed the 10 feet of space in a fraction of a second. Before the lieutenant could even raise his blade, Dominic's hand clamped around the man's throat. With a terrifying crunch that echoed off the brick walls, he lifted the man completely off the ground. The other 2 guards yelled and lunged. Dominic tossed the lieutenant aside like a broken doll and met them. He didn't bother drawing a weapon. He caught the first guard's wrist, snapping it with a casual flick, sending the sword clattering to the stones before driving a knee into the man's chest, collapsing his ribcage. The third guard turned to run, but Finn was already there, tackling him into the mud and knocking him unconscious with the heavy pommel of his dagger. In less than 10 seconds, the alley was silent, save for the rain and the ragged breathing of the woman on the ground. Dominic stood over the bodies of the guards, his chest heaving slightly, the beast beneath his skin practically clawing at his ribs to break free. He slowly turned his attention to the woman. She was pushing herself up on her elbows, coughing weakly, her face obscured by her wet hair. "Are you?" Dominic started, stepping closer. The scent was overpowering now. Winter pine and silver moon. It was suffocating him. The woman looked up. Time stopped, the rain suspended in the air, the sounds of the city faded into absolute silence. Her cheek was bruised, her lip split, and she looked terribly thin. But the sharp cheekbones, the stubborn jaw, and those incredible, defiant green eyes were exactly as they had been burned into his memory. "Jamie," Dominic breathed, his voice cracking. He dropped to his knees in the mud, uncaring of the filth, reaching out with a trembling, blood-stained hand. Jamie flinched away from his touch, scrambling backward against the brick wall. Terror, pure and unadulterated, radiated from her in waves. "Don't touch me," she rasped, pulling a small, crude silver knife from her boot. Her hand shook violently. "Stay away from me, Dominic. I swear to the goddess, I'll put this through your heart." Dominic froze, staring at the silver blade, then at the absolute horror in his mate's eyes. She wasn't looking at a savior, she was looking at a monster. "Mama!" Lily broke free from Morgan's loosened grip and bolted across the alley, throwing her arms around Jamie's neck. "Mama, the big man saved us. He hurt the bad men." Jamie dropped the knife, wrapping her arms protectively around the child, hiding Lily's face in her chest, but keeping her terrified green eyes locked on Dominic. Dominic looked at Jamie, then at the little girl whose eyes were exactly his shade of twilight blue, his daughter. "Finn," Dominic commanded, his voice eerily calm despite the hurricane of shock, rage, and grief tearing through his mind. "Bring my carriage to the edge of the alley. We are going home." The Iron Manor was less a home and more a fortress. Built from dark, heavily reinforced stone on the cliffs overlooking the sea, it was impenetrable. Dominic paced the floor of his expansive study, the fire roaring in the hearth doing nothing to chase the chill from his bones. Down the hall, in the finest guest suite, the Pax physician, an elderly wolf named Beatrice, was tending to Jamie. Lily was asleep in the room adjacent, exhausted from the trauma of the night. Dominic stopped pacing and poured himself a heavy measure of amber liquor, downing it in one burn. Jamie was alive. For 5 years he had visited a marble tomb, mourning ashes he believed were hers. He had waged wars, slaughtered rival packs, and plunged the city into darkness, all out of vengeance for a murder that never happened. And she had been here, living in the slums, hiding from him. A soft knock on the heavy oak door broke his thoughts. Beatrice entered, her face grim. "How is she?" Dominic demanded, closing the distance between them. "She will survive, Alpha," Beatrice said softly, wiping her hands on a cloth. 3 broken ribs, severe malnourishment. Exhaustion. Her wolf has been suppressed for years. I had to use a heavy dose of wolfsbane extract just to calm her down enough to set her ribs. She fought us tooth and nail. She is terrified, Dominic. "Of what?" Dominic growled, the glass in his hand threatening to shatter under his grip. "She is my mate. She knows I would burn this world down before letting harm come to her." Beatrice looked at him with a sorrowful expression. "I do not think she believes that, Alpha. You should go to her. The sedative is wearing off." Dominic didn't wait. He stalked down the dimly lit corridor, his boots making no sound on the thick rugs. He pushed open the heavy door to the guest suite. Jamie was propped up against a mountain of pillows. Cleaned of the mud and blood, wearing one of his oversized linen shirts, she looked painfully fragile. As the door clicked shut, her heart rate spiked. He could hear the rapid thumping against her ribs. "Where is my daughter?" Jamie demanded instantly, her voice hoarse but laced with a mother's defensive venom. "Sleeping," Dominic said softly, staying by the door. He didn't want to crowd her. "She is safe. No one will ever harm either of you again." Jamie let out a bitter, choked laugh. "No one but you mean?" Dominic frowned, stepping further into the room. "Jamie, what are you talking about? 5 years ago, the Bloodwood Pack attacked our estate. I found your wing engulfed in flames. I found the silver chains in the ashes. I thought you were dead. I slaughtered the entire Bloodwood lineage for what they did to you." Jamie stared at him, her chest heaving. "The Bloodwood Pack didn't attack our estate, Dominic. Your men did." The room plunged into an icy silence. "What?" Dominic whispered. "Don't lie to me!" Jamie yelled, wincing as her broken ribs protested. Tears streamed down her face. "You grew tired of me. You needed a pure-blood alpha female to secure your alliances, and I was just a low-born rogue you foolishly claimed." "I heard them, Dominic. I heard Desmond and the others outside my door that night. They poured the oil. I heard Desmond say, 'The alpha sends his regrets, but a street dog doesn't belong in a palace.' They locked the doors and lit the fire." Dominic felt the floor drop out from beneath him. Desmond, his right-hand man, his beta at the time. The man who had heroically dragged Dominic away from the burning rubble 5 years ago, claiming there was no way to save her. "I managed to break the window and shift." Jamie sobbed, her defenses crumbling as she recounted the nightmare. "I ran into the woods. I was already pregnant with Lily. I knew if I stayed, if I revealed I survived, you would just try to kill us again. So I hid. I lived in the dirt, I starved, I took beatings from guards, all to keep her hidden from the monster who sired her." Dominic fell to his knees beside the bed. The monstrous, iron-fisted Mafia boss of Oakhaven looked entirely shattered. He reached into his tunic, pulling out a heavy blackened silver ring on a leather cord around his neck. It was her mating ring, salvaged from the ashes. Jamie, Dominic said, his voice breaking, tears finally spilling from his harsh eyes. Look at me, look into my eyes. She hesitated, then looked. Werewolf eyes could not lie to their mate, the bond wouldn't allow it. I swear on my soul, on the goddess, and on the life of that child sleeping next door. I knew nothing, Dominic vowed, his voice trembling with a terrifying, devastating sincerity. Desmond told me the Bloodwoods did it. He presented forged letters. I made him my beta because he tried to save you, if I had known, if I had even suspected. Jamie stared into his eyes, reading the naked, agonizing truth there. The realization hit her like a physical blow. 5 years of running, of starving, of hating him, built on a betrayal orchestrated by his own second-in-command. Oh, goddess, Jamie whispered, her hands flying to her mouth. Dominic. Dominic stood up slowly. The sorrow in his eyes was instantly replaced by something entirely different. It was a cold, absolute, murderous wrath. The air in the room grew heavy, the very shadows seeming to bend toward him. Desmond has run my northern operations for 3 years, Dominic said, his voice dropping an octave, echoing with the authority of a true alpha. He thought he removed my weakness. He thought he made me a better king. Instead, he stole my family. He turned toward the door. Dominic? Jamie called out, fear of a different kind in her voice. What are you going to do? He paused with his hand on the brass doorknob, looking back over his shoulder. His eyes were no longer twilight blue. They were glowing, radioactive gold. I am going to remind Oakhaven why they call me a monster, he said softly. Rest, my love. By dawn, there will be a new carpet in the throne room, and it will be made of Desmond's skin. The rain had turned to a biting sleet by the time Dominic's carriage, stripped of its usual identifying crests, rattled into the northern ward. This was the wealthy district, a place of towering marble facades, sprawling manors, and velvet-draped gambling dens. It was also the territory Dominic had gifted to Desmond, a reward for his unwavering loyalty after Jamie's supposed death. Inside the carriage, the silence was suffocating. Morgan and Finn sat opposite their alpha, sharpening their blades in rhythm with the clattering wheels. They didn't know the full truth of what had transpired in the guest suite, but they had smelled Jamie's scent. They had smelled the impossible, and they could feel the suffocating, murderous aura pouring off Dominic. It was the aura of an alpha, challenging for a kill. We don't leave a single one of Desmond's personal guard breathing, Dominic stated, his voice devoid of warmth, echoing like stones dropping into a bottomless well. If they bear his personal mark, you take their heads. No prisoners. No interrogations. We are excising a cancer. Understood, boss, Morgan grunted, his own eyes flashing a dangerous, predatory yellow. What about Desmond? Desmond, Dominic whispered, staring out the frosted glass, is mine. The carriage lurched to a halt in front of the Gilded Wolf, Oakhaven's most exclusive underground casino, and the front for Desmond's operations. The twin oak doors were guarded by 4 massive bruisers in tailored coats. Dominic didn't bother with stealth. He kicked the carriage door open, stepping out into the freezing sleet. He didn't draw a sword. He didn't need one. The guards recognized him instantly. Confusion followed by sheer panic painted their faces. Lord Dominic, we weren't expecting Dominic didn't let the man finish. He moved like a shadow detached from the physical world. His hand shot out, claws extending with a sickening snick, tearing through the guard's throat before the man could even reach for his weapon. Finn and Morgan were a blur of motion behind him, their blades flashing in the gaslight. In mere seconds, the 4 guards lay dead in the snow. Dominic kicked the heavy oak doors off their iron hinges. They splintered inward with a deafening crash, silencing the raucous laughter and the clinking of gold coins inside the casino. Hundreds of patrons froze, staring in horror as the alpha of the Iron Syndicate stepped through the threshold, flanked by his blood-soaked enforcers. Dominic's eyes were glowing a brilliant, terrifying gold. The beast was at the surface, straining against its human cage. Everyone who does not wear the mark of the Iron Syndicate has 10 seconds to run. Dominic's voice boomed, amplified by his alpha command, shaking the crystal chandeliers above. After that, I kill everything in this room. Chaos erupted. Noblemen and wealthy merchants shoved each other aside, screaming as they scrambled for the side exits. Dominic ignored them, his gaze locked on the grand staircase at the far end of the hall. At the top of the stairs stood Desmond. He was a tall, handsome werewolf with sleek blonde hair. dressed in impeccable silks. For a fraction of a second, confusion clouded his features, but as he met Dominic's glowing eyes, the color completely drained from his aristocratic face. He knew. "Kill him!" Desmond shrieked to his remaining guards, panic shattering his composed facade. "Kill the Alpha! I'll pay you double triple!" A dozen heavily armed mercenaries drew their steel and charged down the stairs. Morgan and Finn roared, fully giving in to their shifts. Thick fur erupted from their skin, bones snapping and reforming as they transformed into massive, hulking direwolves, throwing themselves into the fray. Dominic didn't shift. He walked, slowly, purposefully, through the carnage, his eyes fixed entirely on Desmond. A mercenary swung a battle axe at Dominic's head. Dominic caught the wooden haft with one bare hand, shattering it like a twig, and drove his fist through the man's chest cavity. Desmond turned and bolted down the luxurious upper corridor. Dominic stalked after him, the screams and the sounds of rending flesh fading into background noise. He followed the stench of Desmond's terror, a cloying, sour smell, until he reached the opulent master office at the end of the hall. The door was locked. Dominic slammed his fist into the heavy mahogany. The wood splintered, another punch, and the locking mechanism exploded. He stepped inside. The room was lavishly decorated with stolen art and rare furs. Desmond was backed against his heavy desk, aiming a loaded, silver-barreled flintlock directly at Dominic's chest. His hands were shaking violently. "Stay back!" Desmond screamed, his voice pitching high. "I did it for the Syndicate, Dominic. I did it for you. She made you soft. You were going to negotiate peace with the royals. We are wolves. We are meant to conquer, not compromise with humans." "You tried to burn my mate alive," Dominic said, his voice terrifyingly calm, the absolute stillness of a predator before the killing strike. "You condemned my daughter to live in the gutters." Desmond's eyes widened in shock. "Daughter?" Dominic stepped forward. Desmond pulled the trigger. The deafening crack echoed through the room. The silver bullet tore through Dominic's shoulder, a searing, toxic agony that would have dropped a lesser wolf to his knees. Dominic barely flinched. The wound smoked, burning his flesh, but his forward momentum didn't break. Before Desmond could drop the empty pistol and draw his sword, Dominic's hand clamped around the traitor's throat, hoisting him off the ground. Desmond kicked frantically, his hands clawing at Dominic's iron grip. "You think you won?" Desmond choked out, blood bubbling past his lips, a twisted, desperate smile forming. "You think I acted alone? You think a beta could bypass the manor's security without a royal cipher?" Dominic narrowed his eyes, his grip tightening just enough to crack cartilage. "Speak." "Lord Harrison," Desmond gasped, mentioning the king's own uncle, the ruthless minister of shadows. "He wanted you, isolated, mad with grief, a rabid dog. Is easier to point at his enemies. He supplied the oil, the silver chains. He knows, Dominic. If you kill me, the crown will bring the entire royal army down on your head." "Let them come," Dominic whispered, leaning in close. "I will drown them in the same blood I'm about to drown you in." Dominic's claws extended, and with one brutal, decisive motion, he ripped the traitor's throat out. Desmond's body fell to the plush carpet with a heavy thud. Dominic stood over the corpse, the silver bullet still burning in his shoulder, ignoring the pain. War was coming to Oakhaven, but this time, the monster had something to protect. The storm was finally breaking when Dominic returned to the Iron Manor. The sky bruised purple and dull gray, a reflection of the violence that had just stained the northern ward. He slipped through the servants' entrance, avoiding the main halls. He was covered in blood, most of it. Desmond's, some of it his own, and his shoulder throbbed with a sickening, toxic ache from the embedded silver bullet. He found Beatrice, the pack physician, waiting for him in his private chambers. She took one look at his ruined shoulder and pale face, instantly grabbing her surgical kit. "Sit," she commanded, pointing to a leather chair. She didn't ask questions. The metallic tang of blood and the dark satisfaction rolling off him told her everything she needed to know. The traitor was dead. Dominic gritted his teeth, gripping the arms of the chair so hard the leather groaned, as Beatrice dug the silver bullet out of his flesh with a pair of long forceps. "She is awake," Beatrice murmured, as she began packing the wound with a paste of crushed dittany and wolfsbane to draw out the silver poisoning. "She fed the child, but she jumps at every shadow, Alpha. You must tread lightly. The mate bond is strong, but trauma creates heavy chains." "I know," Dominic breathed, closing his eyes, letting the pain ground him. He stood up, shrugging off his ruined, blood-soaked shirt, and walked into his adjoining washroom. He spent 20 minutes scrubbing the blood from beneath his fingernails, washing the scent of death and copper from his skin. He couldn't go to them smelling like a slaughterhouse. He needed to be the man Jamie fell in love with, not the monster the city feared. Dressed in a clean linen shirt and soft trousers, he walked down the quiet corridor to the guest suite. He paused outside the heavy oak door, his heart hammering against his ribs in a way that no battle had ever caused. He knocked softly. "Come in," came Jamie's tentative voice. Dominic pushed the door open. The fire had burned down to glowing embers. Jamie was sitting on the edge of the large four-poster bed, combing her fingers through Lily's dark hair. The little girl was curled in her mother's lap, wearing a nightgown that was far too large for her, clutching a stuffed velvet bear that one of the maids had dug out of storage. As Dominic entered, Jamie's posture instantly stiffened. Her eyes darted to his face, searching for the madness she had feared for 5 years. But she only saw exhaustion and a deep, profound vulnerability. Lily, however, perked up. "The big man," she chirped, her hazel eyes bright. She slipped off Jamie's lap and trotted over to him, completely devoid of fear. Dominic dropped to one knee, ignoring the agonizing pull in his wounded shoulder, so he was eye-level with his daughter. Up close, the resemblance was shattering. She had his nose, his jawline, and the exact shape of his eyes. "Hello, little one," Dominic said, his voice incredibly soft, terrified of breaking the fragile moment. "Are you a knight?" Lily asked, tilting her head. "Like the ones in Mama's stories? You saved us from the bad men in the shiny shirts." Dominic swallowed hard, glancing up at Jamie. She was watching them, her breath hitched in her throat, tears pooling in her green eyes. She hadn't poisoned the child against him. She had told her stories of knights. "No, Lily," Dominic said, looking back at his daughter. "I'm not a knight. I'm your father." Lily blinked, processing the information with the innocent logic of a 4-year-old. She looked back at Jamie. "Mama? Is he my papa?" Jamie slowly nodded, wiping a tear from her cheek. "Yes, sweetie, he is." Lily turned back to Dominic and without a second's hesitation, threw her small arms around his neck, burying her face in his clean shirt. "I knew you were big," she mumbled happily. Dominic closed his eyes, wrapping his large, calloused hands carefully around her tiny frame. A ragged sob tore its way up his throat, escaping before he could suppress it. The ruthless mob boss, the alpha who had just slaughtered a room full of men without blinking, buried his face in his daughter's hair and wept. After a few minutes, Beatrice slipped into the room to take Lily down to the kitchens for some warm milk and honey, giving the parents a moment alone. Dominic stood up, walking slowly toward the bed. He stopped a few feet away, respecting Jamie's space. "Desmond is dead," Dominic said quietly. Jamie shuddered, wrapping her arms around herself. "It won't bring back the last 5 years, Dominic. It won't erase the cold, or the hunger, or the fear." "I know," he replied, his voice breaking. "I cannot rewrite history, Jamie. I can only beg for your forgiveness and spend every breath I have left proving to you that I am not the monster Desmond made you believe I was." Jamie looked up at him, studying the dark circles under his eyes, the tense set of his shoulders. She could feel his sincerity through the mate bond, vibrating like a plucked string between their souls. "Desmond wasn't working alone, was he?" Jamie asked, her intuition sharp despite her exhaustion. "He was ambitious, but he was a coward. He wouldn't have risked the wrath of an alpha without backing." Dominic sighed, running a hand through his hair. He confessed before he died. He had help from the crown, Lord Harrison. Jamie gasped, her eyes going wide. "The king's uncle? Dominic, if the crown is involved, they won't stop. They wanted you destroyed. If they find out I am alive, and that you have an heir." "They won't touch you," Dominic snarled, the predator flashing in his eyes for a split second before he suppressed it. He stepped closer, dropping to his knees beside the bed, carefully taking her trembling hands in his. "They wanted a rabid dog," Dominic vowed, pressing a kiss to her scarred knuckles. "They wanted a monster to tear this city apart so they could swoop in and claim the pieces. Well, they have their monster. But I am not tearing the city apart. I am tearing the throne down. For you. For Lily." Jamie looked into his twilight blue eyes, seeing the unyielding iron there. The fear that had gripped her heart for 5 years finally began to thaw, replaced by a terrifying, thrilling realization. The king of the underworld was going to war against the king of the realm, and he was doing it all for her. Dawn broke over Oakhaven not with the promise of sunlight, but with the bruised, heavy gray of an impending siege. The Iron Manor had transformed overnight. Gone was the quiet, menacing hum of a Mafia headquarters. In its place was the deafening, frantic rhythm of a war camp preparing for absolute carnage. From the heavy arched window of the master suite, Jamie looked down into the courtyard. Hundreds of syndicate fighters, werewolves, rogue elementalists, and battle-hardened mercenaries were sharpening silver-coated steel, loading muskets, and reinforcing the massive iron portcullis. The air smelled of wood smoke, wet fur, and the sharp tang of adrenaline. Behind her, the soft rustle of silk sheets drew her attention. Lily was sprawled across the center of Dominic's massive, four-poster bed, dead to the world, clutching her velvet bear. For the first time in her 4 years of life, the little girl had slept through the night without waking up shivering or crying from hunger. "She has your resilience," a deep voice murmured. Jamie turned. Dominic stood in the doorway of the adjoining washroom. He was dressed in heavy, dark leather armor, a stark contrast to the tailored suits he usually wore to intimidate the city's underworld. A broadsword was strapped to his back, and twin silver-plated daggers rested at his hips. He looked like exactly what he was, a warlord stepping onto the battlefield. Jamie crossed her arms, her green eyes scanning his face. She shouldn't have to be resilient. She's a child. "I know," Dominic said softly, stepping into the room. He kept a respectful distance, his posture open, non-threatening, and after this week, she will never have to be again. "I promise you that." Jamie looked back out the window at the assembling army. "You are marching on the capital, against the king's vanguard. Dominic, they have thousands of men. They have cannons forged with liquid silver." "I have the Iron Syndicate," Dominic replied, his voice a low, vibrating rumble of supreme confidence. "The crown rules by decree. We rule by survival. There is a difference in how a man fights when he is fighting for a paycheck versus fighting for his life." He paused, his twilight blue eyes softening as he looked at her. "But I need to know you are safe before I leave these walls. I have doubled the perimeter guard. Finn will remain here with 50 of our best—" "No," Jamie interrupted, her voice surprisingly firm. Dominic blinked, taken aback. "Jamie, Lord Harrison knows Desmond failed. He knows you are alive. The manor is the only fortress strong enough." "I am not staying in a tower while you fight my battles, Dominic," Jamie said, stepping away from the window and closing the distance between them. For the first time in 5 years, she didn't flinch as she drew near him. The trauma was still there, a heavy anchor in her chest, but the fire of her alpha blood suppressed by years of starvation and fear was finally sparking back to life. "5 years ago, I ran because I thought my mate wanted me dead," Jamie said, her voice trembling but resolute. "I hid in the mud. I let guards kick me so my daughter could eat scraps. I will never be a victim again. If the crown wants my head, they are going to have to look me in the eyes when they try to take it." Dominic stared at her. The fierce, unyielding glow in her green eyes was the exact reason his wolf had chosen her all those years ago. She wasn't just a survivor, she was a queen in exile. Before Dominic could argue, the heavy oak doors of the suite burst open. Morgan stood there, chest heaving, his eyes flashing a frantic yellow. "Boss," Morgan grunted, ignoring the breach of protocol. "You need to get down to the courtyard, right now." Dominic's posture instantly shifted from a tender mate to a lethal alpha. "What is it?" "It's the Royal Vanguard," Morgan spat, gripping the hilt of his sword. "They aren't waiting for us to march. They're at the gates." The rain began to fall again as Dominic strode into the courtyard, his boots splashing against the wet cobblestones. The syndicate fighters parted for him like the sea, their murmurs falling dead silent as their alpha took the front line. Jamie followed closely behind him, wrapped in a thick, fur-lined cloak, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had told Finn to guard Lily's door with his life, refusing to be left out of the confrontation. Beyond the massive iron gates of the manor sat a terrifying display of royal power. 300 heavily armored knights of the Royal Vanguard sat atop armored warhorses. Their cloaks were the deep crimson of the crown, and the rain slicked off their silver-tipped lances. At the front of the column rode a man in gleaming gold-inlaid plate armor, Captain Sterling. He was known throughout Oakhaven as the king's most brutal enforcer, a man who burned down entire villages over unpaid taxes. Dominic stepped up to the iron bars of the gate, his hands resting casually on his hips. He didn't look like a man facing down an army. He looked like a landlord dealing with a noise complaint. "Sterling," Dominic called out, his voice carrying effortlessly over the thunder. "You're out of your jurisdiction. The Northern Ward is a long ride for men wearing so much metal." Captain Sterling sneered, pulling his horse to a halt a few feet from the gates. "Lord Dominic, by decree of His Royal Majesty, and under the direct orders of the Minister of Shadows, Lord Harrison, I am here to arrest you for the brutal murder of the nobleman Desmond." Dominic let out a low, dark laugh that made several of the vanguard horses nervously step backward. "Desmond was syndicate. Internal dispute. The Crown has no say in how I discipline my dogs." "The Crown has a say in all things," Sterling barked, his face flushing with anger. He pulled a rolled parchment from his belt. "But Lord Harrison is a merciful man. He knows the syndicate is vital to the economy of the lower wards. He offers a trade." Dominic went completely still. The air around him seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Speak." Sterling's eyes flicked past Dominic, landing on Jamie standing in the shadows of the courtyard. A cruel, knowing smile stretched across his face. "We know the dead woman returned," Sterling projected, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "Lord Harrison is willing to pardon your crimes, Dominic. He is willing to let you keep your criminal empire. All you have to do is hand over the woman and the bastard child." A deafening, terrifying roar ripped from Dominic's chest. It wasn't human. It was the sound of a primordial beast breaking its chains. His eyes flared a blinding, radioactive gold, and his claws unsheathed, carving deep gouges into the solid iron bars of the gate. "If you so much as look at her again," Dominic snarled, his voice distorted, vibrating with dark magic, "I will rip your eyes from your skull and feed them to my hounds." Sterling drew his silver broadsword, his men leveling their lances. "You would sacrifice your entire empire for a low-born street rat? She is a rogue, Dominic, a peasant." "She is not a peasant." The voice was clear, ringing like a silver bell over the tension. Dominic blinked, turning his head. Jamie pushed past him, stepping right up to the iron gates. She dropped the hood of her cloak. The rain plastered her dark hair to her cheeks, but she stood tall, her spine forged of steel. "You call me a street rat," Jamie said, staring directly into Sterling's eyes. "But Lord Harrison knows exactly what I am, doesn't he? That is why he provided the oil and the silver chains 5 years ago. That is why he wants me and my daughter dead today." Sterling's sneer faltered. A flicker of genuine unease crossed his face. "Silence, whore. Open the gates." Jamie didn't flinch. She reached up and pulled back the collar of her shirt, revealing a faded crescent moon birthmark resting against her collarbone. "My mother was a maid in the lower wards," Jamie projected, her voice commanding the attention of every soldier, criminal, and wolf in the courtyard. "But my father was King Alaric Caldwell, the true alpha of this realm, before your current king poisoned him and stole his throne." A shockwave of gasps rippled through the syndicate fighters. Even Morgan dropped his jaw. Dominic stared at his mate, utterly stunned. Caldwell, the lost royal bloodline, the true heirs to Oakhaven. "Lord Harrison found out who I was 5 years ago," Jamie continued, her voice rising, filled with a righteous, furious power. "He couldn't risk a true Caldwell alpha mating with the most powerful warlord in the city. Together, we would have the legitimate claim and the military strength to take back the throne, so he ordered Desmond to burn me." She grabbed the iron bars, her green eyes blazing with a feral light. "Tell Lord Harrison his fire wasn't hot enough. Tell him the true Queen of Oakhaven has returned, and I am coming for his head." Sterling turned pale. The secret was out. The entire syndicate had just heard that their alpha's mate wasn't just a rogue, she was the rightful ruler of the kingdom. "Kill them!" Sterling shrieked in panic, dropping his visor. "Breach the gates! Leave no one alive!" Dominic didn't wait for the vanguard to charge. He looked at Jamie, his chest swelling with an overwhelming mixture of awe, pride, and terrifying devotion. She had just given them a cause greater than revenge. She had given them a holy war. "Open the gates," Dominic commanded Morgan, his voice eerily calm. "Boss?" Morgan asked, stunned. "They're charging." "I said open the gates." Dominic smiled, drawing his massive broadsword, the steel singing in the rain. Let's show the king's men how a real pack hunts." As the iron portcullis began to grind upward, Dominic stepped forward, his body exploding into movement as he shifted mid-leap, a massive, terrifying twilight-furred direwolf launching itself straight into the heart of the royal cavalry. The battle for the throne of Oakhaven had officially begun. The courtyard of the Iron Manor erupted into absolute bedlam. The clash of Vanguard's steel against the supernatural fury of the Iron Syndicate sounded like the shattering of the world itself. Dominic, fully shifted into a monstrous, twilight-furred direwolf, standing nearly 7 feet at the shoulder, tore through the front lines of the royal cavalry. His jaws, capable of snapping solid iron, crushed through silver-plated lances and armored chest plates with terrifying ease. He was a force of nature, a hurricane of teeth and claws, driven by the agonizing, beautiful realization that his mate, his true queen, was watching him fight for their family. Morgan and the other enforcers shifted as well, a wave of massive, snarling beasts crashing into the panicked warhorses. But the vanguard were elite soldiers, armed with weaponry specifically forged to kill their kind. "Form the phalanx!" Captain Sterling screamed over the din, his horse rearing as he tried to maintain order. "Bring up the Medici ironworks, repeating cannons, load the silver shrapnel, break these beasts!" From the rear of the royal column, heavy wagons were dragged forward. Canvas tarps were thrown off to reveal massive, multi-barreled cannons machinery, imported from the secretive Medici Ironworks, a real-world guild of weaponsmiths that armed the wealthiest despots across the sea. The smell of sulfur mixed with the rain. If those cannons fired, the silver shrapnel would shred the syndicate's front line to ribbons, wolf healing or not. Dominic saw the cannons and roared, a sound that shook the rain from the clouds, trying to carve a path through the sea of knights to reach the artillery. But he was bogged down by a dozen spearmen who had boxed him in, their silver tips keeping the Alpha at bay. Suddenly, the air in the courtyard changed. The sharp smell of ozone and winter pine flooded the battlefield, so thick and suffocating that even the vanguard horses began to buck and scream in terror. Jamie stepped out from the shadows of the arched gateway. She wasn't wearing armor. She didn't hold a sword. But as she walked forward, her eyes began to glow, not the gold of a typical werewolf, but a blinding, luminescent emerald. The dormant power of the Caldwell Alpha bloodline, suppressed by years of starvation, grief, and fear, finally shattered its cage. "Drop your weapons!" Jamie's voice echoed, amplified by raw, ancient magic. It didn't just reach their ears, it reverberated in the marrow of their bones. It was the absolute command of the true Royal Alpha. Half of the Vanguard Knights, those who had trace amounts of wolf blood in their lineage, a common trait in Oakhaven's military, instantly dropped to their knees, their swords clattering against the cobblestones. They physically could not disobey the genetic imperative to submit to a Caldwell. Sterling, purely human and immune to the command, stared in absolute horror as half his strike force surrendered to a woman in a soaked linen shirt. "Fire the cannons!" Sterling shrieked at the artillerists. "Fire them now!" "No!" Dominic roared, throwing off the spearmen, his massive paws tearing up the earth as he sprinted toward the artillery wagons. But he was too far. The artillerist brought a blazing torch down toward the fuse. A shadow dropped from the ramparts above. Finn, who had disobeyed Jamie's order to stay at the bedroom door and instead positioned himself on the roof, landed directly on the artillerist. With a vicious swipe of his dual daggers, Finn severed the mechanism, kicking the burning torch into the wet mud just before it could ignite the powder. Seeing his artillery neutralized and half his men kneeling in the mud, Sterling panicked. He spurred his horse, not toward the gates, but directly at Jamie, drawing a hidden, silver-loaded flintlock pistol. "If the king falls, the kingdom burns!" Sterling screamed, aiming the barrel right at Jamie's chest. He never pulled the trigger. A massive, black shape hit Sterling's horse from the side, like a runaway freight train. Dominic had crossed the courtyard in a fraction of a second. The impact shattered the horse's ribs, sending Sterling flying through the air to crash brutally against the stone wall of the manor. Dominic shifted back to his human form seamlessly, landing on his feet over the broken, gasping body of Captain Sterling. He didn't bother with a weapon. He simply reached down, grabbed Sterling by the heavy gold breastplate, and lifted him into the air. "You came to my home," Dominic whispered, his voice a lethal velvet rasp. "You threatened my mate. You threatened my daughter." "Mercy," Sterling choked out, blood dripping from his nose. The minister. The minister is next, Dominic promised. With a sickening crunch, he drove his armored fist into Sterling's chest, ending the captain's life. Dominic dropped the body and turned to look at Jamie. She was breathing heavily, the emerald glow slowly fading from her eyes, leaving her looking exhausted but magnificent. She had not only survived, she had brought the king's vanguard to its knees. He walked over to her, entirely uncaring of his blood-soaked clothes or the hundreds of men watching them. He fell to one knee in the mud at her feet, bowing his head. "My queen," Dominic said, his voice carrying the absolute devotion of a mated wolf. Behind him, Morgan, Finn, and the entirety of the Iron Syndicate dropped to their knees. A moment later, the remaining conscious Vanguard Knights, recognizing that they were on the wrong side of history, followed suit. The courtyard was completely silent, save for the rain. Jamie looked down at the fearsome Mafia boss kneeling in the mud for her. She reached out, her trembling hand tracing the harsh lines of his jaw, pulling him up to stand beside her. "Not your queen," Jamie said softly, looking into his twilight eyes. "Your mate. And it is time we took our city back." The march on the royal citadel was not a chaotic riot. It was a cold, calculated avalanche of iron and fur. Word of the Caldwell heir's miraculous return and the Iron Syndicate's crushing victory over Captain Sterling had bled through the districts of Oakhaven faster than spilled ink on parchment. By the time Dominic and Jamie's forces reached the gilded, towering gates of the High Ward, their numbers had swelled to an unstoppable tide of thousands. Citizens who had suffered under the crown's exorbitant taxes, rogue wolves who had been hunted for sport, and defecting royal guards voluntarily stripped of their crimson tabards, all joined the procession. Dominic rode a massive midnight black destrier, wearing the heavy, scarred leather armor of a warlord. Beside him, Jamie rode a pale mare, draped in the dark, elegant leathers of the Syndicate, a silver cloak pinned to her shoulder. They did not look like rebels storming a castle. They looked like returning conquerors reclaiming what was stolen from them. Behind them, Morgan and Finn commanded the rear guard, dragging the captured multi-barreled cannons machinery imported from the Medici ironworks as a grim warning to any who might still harbor loyalty to the old regime. The heavy iron wheels ground against the cobblestones, a rhythmic drumming that echoed the beating heart of the uprising. Even the ruthless debt collectors of the Astor banking clan, who usually hid in their fortified manors during civil unrest, stood on their balconies and bowed their heads as the Alpha and his mate rode past. The city knew exactly who held the power now. The Citadel's outer defenses, a formidable wall of sheer white marble and iron-wrought portcullises, were already breached. The Royal Guard, seeing the sea of angry, heavily armed citizens and the terrifying gold-eyed Alpha leading them, simply laid down their halberds and stepped aside. They were men paid by the coin, and no amount of silver was worth facing a true Alpha and the rightful Caldwell Queen. Dominic and Jamie dismounted at the base of the Citadel's sweeping marble staircase. The massive oak doors to the Grand Hall stood ajar, splintered from where fleeing nobles had forced their way out in a panicked stampede. "Stay close," Dominic murmured to Jamie, his voice a low, protective rumble as he drew his silver-plated broadsword. The blade sang a deadly, ringing note in the damp air. "I am right beside you," Jamie replied, her green eyes cold and focused. The trembling, terrified woman who had cowered in a mud-soaked alleyway just a day prior was gone, replaced by the indomitable spirit of her royal bloodline. They crossed the threshold into the cavernous Grand Hall. The ceiling stretched 100 feet high, painted with frescoes of ancient battles, while stained glass windows cast blood-red and bruised purple light across the polished floors. At the far end of the hall, sitting casually on the gilded royal seat of power, was Lord Harrison, the Minister of Shadows. The king himself had already fled like a coward through the subterranean catacombs, abandoning his uncle to face the wrath of the city. Harrison was a withered, calculating man, his robes heavily embroidered with gold thread and dark velvet. Even as the heavy oak doors swung fully open and Dominic strode into the room, flanked by Jamie and his deadliest enforcers, Harrison maintained a mask of chilling, aristocratic arrogance. "Treason is such a messy, unrefined business, Lord Dominic," Harrison sneered, his voice echoing sharply off the vaulted ceilings. He remained seated, steepling his thin fingers together. "You think because you have a rabble of peasants and stray dogs behind you, you can usurp the crown? The neighboring kingdoms will never recognize a mafia thug and a half-starved rogue. You will be blockaded, starved, and eventually executed. They will recognize the Caldwell bloodline. Jamie stepped forward, her voice ringing out with an authority that commanded the absolute silence of the room. Or their economies will collapse when we shut down the trading ports. Oakhaven controls the seas, Harrison. And I control Oakhaven. Harrison's calculating eyes narrowed at her, a flicker of genuine hatred breaking through his composed facade. Ah, the miraculous survivor. I should have inspected the ashes myself 5 years ago. I underestimated Desmond's incompetence, just as I overestimated his ambition. I hired the Pinkerton Guild of Trackers to sweep the lower wards twice a year. How you managed to hide beneath my very nose is a testament to your low-born resilience. Dominic let out a low, terrifying growl that vibrated the stained glass windows. His knuckles turned white around the hilt of his broadsword. You ordered the brutal death of my mate. You ordered the death of an unborn child. You poisoned this city with corruption and greed. I secured the realm, Harrison shouted, suddenly standing up, his composure completely shattering under the crushing weight of Dominic's alpha aura. He pointed a trembling finger at Jamie. A Caldwell ruling alongside the Iron Syndicate? You would have plunged us into war with the human territories. I did what was necessary for the survival of the state. I orchestrated the king's rise. I funded the vanguard through the Astor banking clan, and I kept the wolves on a leash. I am the kingmaker. And I, Dominic said softly, his voice dropping to a lethal, velvet whisper as he began to walk up the marble steps, am the executioner. Harrison scrambled backward, his velvet robes tangling around his ankles. He reached frantically for a concealed lever on the armrest of the royal chair, hoping to trigger a hidden trapdoor, but he was far too slow. Dominic crossed the remaining distance in a blur of preternatural speed. He didn't give the Minister of Shadows a chance to speak, to negotiate, or to beg for his miserable life. With a single, brutal, and flawless swing of his broadsword, Dominic severed Harrison's head entirely from his shoulders. The heavy, sickening thud of the body, hitting the marble floor, echoed in the absolute, breathless silence of the grand hall. Dominic stood over the ruined corpse for a long moment, his chest heaving. The silver-plated steel in his hand dripped crimson onto the pristine white stone. He slowly reached into his pocket, pulling out a dark linen cloth, and meticulously wiped the blade clean before sliding it back into the scabbard strapped to his back. The war was over. The architect of their 5 years of absolute agony was dead. He turned his back on the empty seat of power, walking down the steps to where Jamie stood. The fierce, untouchable queen melted the moment he reached her, wrapping her arms tightly around his armored waist, burying her face in his chest. Dominic held her, resting his chin on the top of her head, finally allowing himself to breathe. Suddenly, a tiny, bright voice broke the heavy, blood-soaked silence of the room. "Mama?" Everyone turned. Standing in the massive double doors of the grand hall, flanked by an exhausted but smiling Beatrice and heavily guarded by a dozen syndicate men, was little Lily. She was wearing a brand-new, dark blue velvet dress that perfectly matched Dominic's eyes, her worn stuffed bear clutched tightly in her small arms. She looked around the massive, intimidating room with wide hazel eyes, entirely unbothered by the armored soldiers, until she spotted her parents. "Papa," she squealed, her face lighting up with pure, unadulterated joy. She broke away from Beatrice's gentle grip and ran as fast as her little legs could carry her down the long crimson carpet. Dominic dropped heavily to his knees, uncaring of the blood on the floor, catching his daughter as she collided with his chest. He scooped her up, burying his face in her dark hair, inhaling the deep, grounding scent of winter pine and silver moon. A single hot tear slipped down the ruthless mob boss's scarred cheek, soaking into the velvet of her dress. Jamie knelt beside them, wrapping her arms around both her alpha and her child, pressing a soft, lingering kiss to Dominic's temple. They were a portrait of unbreakable devotion, the ruthless king of the underworld, the lost queen of the realm, and the little girl whose courage had saved them all. "Are we going home now?" Lily asked innocently, pulling back to look at Dominic, her tiny hands resting against the cold leather of his armor. Dominic looked up at the empty, blood-stained seat of power, then back down at the thousands of people pouring into the grand hall, waiting in silent reverence for their new ruler's first command. Finally, he looked at Jamie, who smiled softly, a fierce, undeniable strength burning in her emerald eyes. "Yes, little one," Dominic said, his voice thick with emotion as he stood up, lifting Lily effortlessly into his arms so she could look out over the vast hall. He reached out with his free hand and intertwined his fingers tightly with Jamie's. "We are already home." And that is how the most feared mafia boss in Oakhaven didn't just save his family, he conquered a kingdom for them. From the muddy alleys of the lower ward to the gilded throne of the Citadel, Dominic and Jamie's journey proves that the mate bond can survive the darkest of betrayals. Did that explosive finale leave you speechless? Smash that like button if you loved seeing Jamie unlock her Caldwell alpha power, and share this video with your fellow dark romance and werewolf fans. We need to grow this pack. If you want more epic stories filled with ruthless alphas, secret royal bloodlines, and mafia twists, you must subscribe and ring that notification bell. We drop jaw-dropping, high-stakes audio dramas every single week, and you don't want to miss what we're cooking up next.